The president of Brown University is Dr. Vartan Gregorian, a very bright, interesting, nice guy, in case he ever hears me speak. Consider the following situation, purely hypothetical. Dr. Gregorian has a certain cabin in the woods where he goes to escape the pressures of the day, and he sits on the deck of his cabin, and he rocks in his rocking chairs, and he thinks about great issues like the curriculum at Brown, and raising money for Brown, and raising money for faculty salaries, they in ascending orders of significance. And Gregorian is rocking on his rocking chair one day, and he looks across the valley to his neighbor, and the neighbor on his porch has put some sort of a machine that is emitting smoke, and that's or something, and that emission is blowing over Gregorian's cabin. Being a prudent fellow, he takes sterile samples of each of these various smoke emissions, and he comes down to Brown University, where he convenes the chairpersons of the departments of biology, internal medicine, and physics, each of whom comes to the meeting in a white coat. They do whatever they need to do to these samples of smoke, and they conclude that this is highly carcinogenic, highly carcinogenic. Gregorian calls the sheriff and says, make the guy stop the machine. Yes or no, the sheriff should make the guy stop the machine. Everybody votes. Anybody say no? Overwhelming response from the audience. Case, yes, we don't know enough, of course. Well, but your intuitions, quickly, I got you to say yes. Case number 2. Gregorian looks off the same porch with the same routine, and he sees the same neighbor, and there is a huge mural. The neighbor has hung this huge mural in front of his cabin, and Gregorian thinks it is one gross, ugly mural. So being a prudent fellow, he takes a good Polaroid camera, takes back shots of this mural, and convenes at the university the chairpersons of the Department of Art, Music, and Classics, none of whom come in a white coat. The 3 chairpersons of the Departments of Art, Music, and Classics confirm that this is the ugliest mural that has ever been painted. Uglier than any other known mural. Gregorian calls the same sheriff and says, take down the mural. Yes or no, they should? No. Oh, how did I know? How did I know? If I dwelt on it long enough and beat you into the ground enough, we would come to the recognition that I think what you are making is a strong distinction between facts and values. The way I set it up with the chemist and the physicist and the internal physician, or whatever I said, you think is empirical, is scientific, doesn't too much involve the attitudes of the observer. You think, and I think it's important, that if a doctor looks through the telescope, or the microscope, and looks at a smear that has been prepared, and is it carcinogenic or not carcinogenic? Is there malignancy, in the tissue sample? We would very much like to believe that it doesn't matter whether the doctor is a Democrat or a Republican or a man or a woman or religious or secular, that if the doctor says that through the microscope it shows cancer cells, that ought to be replicable. Other doctors with different politics should see the same malignancy. It ought to be standard. It ought to be factual. It gives us real certainty in areas that we need it. So you can think back to all of the things that I've suggested in this series of discussions thus far, where precision, stability, knowledge, dangerous sounds like a very precise neutral. Neutral sounds like a neutral sounding word. Whereas, I think you assume, when I invoked the chairpersons of, what did I say, music, art, and classics, I think you assume different strokes for different folks. I asked you earlier, and you told me beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I will tell you one true story that happened to me in Washington. What's the wing of the National Gallery that has the big Calder mobile? So I had the fortune to be in Washington on business a half a year after the East Wing opened, and my host said, we must take time out and show you the East Wing. So he took me to see the East Wing. The East Wing was surrounded by yellow school buses. Every junior high school in Maryland and Virginia, which is fine. I mean, absolutely fine. There were all these little kids. It was during the day, and they're there. And I tell you that this is a true story. I walked past 2 little kids, I don't know, 15-year-old kids, and one is pointing up at a very abstract painting and saying, it ain't finished. To which his classmate's answer was, it is finished. They wouldn't have hung it in the museum if it weren't finished. How far would you like to go on a distinction between art and trash? On a distinction between art and trash. Hold on to that for just a moment and let me come back to something from an earlier session and see how they two, I hope, tie in together. Or don't, because everything can be either compared or contrasted by definition. But let's see. We spoke about in an earlier session about the issue of the definition of death. And I mentioned that there were two approaches, what is called Harvard brain death and what is called common law definition of cardiovascular death. And why we mentioned that the organ transplants essentially require the early harvesting, that is the word that's used, the early harvesting of organs, and the success rates are extremely different if they can use the brain dead definition and remove the organs earlier. How did the New York State Court, there's now a statute in New York, but the court that initially went in that direction basically called in experts. I teased you already about experts. They called in about 20 doctors with titles like Chief of Neurology at, Chief of Neurosurgery at, Chief of Anesthesiology at, and the ATs were great hospitals, great teaching centers. I think that use of experts is highly questionable, or I think it is perhaps better to say subject to significant misunderstanding. I think it is correct to view certain questions as subject to scientific expertise. So the question of whether a certain exposure to a certain toxin will result in death X% of the time, that is not something to be made by lay people uninformed by scientific information. I don't know, and you don't know unless you're trained in these areas, what the consequence of a certain smoke would be on Gregorian's porch. And I think in that sense, science has a claim, and the fact-value distinction is reasonable. And in that limited case, tell us empirically what the probabilities are. And indeed, as I digress, one must be acutely aware that it's easy for one guy's opinion to become authority. But let's assume you don't do that. The 20 or so famous medical doctors or doctors at famous medical institutions who advised the judge in Solsana gave her statistics about the rejection rates of certain kinds of transplants and how many fewer would be rejected if a different definition were used. All right? And on the make-believe case of Gregorian and the smoke, it is easy to say that his chemist gave him correct information about the likelihood of incidences of cancer being increased. That is the claim for scientific expertise. Look through the telescope, says Galileo to his critics in the church. It doesn't matter what you believe, look through the telescope. The data are there. The sun does not rotate around the earth. Huh? Where I think we are into a lot of trouble is when we ask the same three scientists, or whomever, to tell us what is an acceptable risk. That, I think, is not a question that is subject to technical expertise. So, if they're going to, I'll stick with the Gregorian smoke, if the information comes back that it will increase the number of lung cancers in the population by 2 to 1, double the number of lung cancers, yes or no, that's significant? Absolutely. The porch case isn't going to work. They want to build a nuclear reactor on the corner of the street that we live on. The neighbors around this nuclear reactor call in physicists, chemists, all that kind of good stuff. And we want to know, is it a serious risk, health risk or not? And they testify that for reasons that they give data, the likelihood of incidence of cancer will double in your neighborhood within 10 years. Yes or no, that's a significant health risk. It will increase by 1 in 500,000 cases. That's a significant increase? I hear concerns. I can play the numbers in either direction, right? What did I say? 1 in 5 million. Is that a significant health risk? 1 in 50? 1 in 2,000? 1 in... See, my claim is that the empirical evidence must be presented to us by persons who know. And we need to be very careful. Just because medicine has always done a certain thing, maybe more out of prejudice or convenience, so they never stop to think about it. So one should ask. John Stuart Mill, one should ask. but understand the limits of expertise. And the way I'm asserting the argument, there is a claim for expertise where there are data that can be replicated, where science has standards as to what constitutes evidence. How do we know whether this is carcinogenic or not? I mean, I don't know, but I presume that others do know. A different question is how much is too much? What risks are worth taking? Which brings me back to the New York State case and the definition of death. The judge in that case talks about the number of people waiting online for transplants to show that there is a great public health need. I don't remember the number, but it's in a published opinion. She was told that there are so many and so many patients waiting online for transplants. And then she was told things about the statistical likelihood of rejections if they use the one rather than the other. And on the basis of that information, she issued an injunction allowing the removal of the kidneys, I think, or whatever it is that they were looking for on this particular organ donor, accepting Harvard brain death as death. That sounds rather utilitarian, you know. My children who know about these things tell me about a certain Monty Python movie. Anyone who knows the I think it's called The Meaning of Death, or The Meaning of Life. The Meaning of Monty Python. My children, who are not invited to give this talk, tell me about a certain Monty Python movie where one of the gimmicks is some doctor types show up and say to what looks like a perfectly normal, healthy guy, "We've come for your liver." I beg your pardon? "You signed the donor card for your liver." "Yes, that's right." "Well, we need it." "I'm using it." I mean, that's absurd, right? He's using it. You can't take that away. Even to save Isaac Stern's daughter, or Isaac Stern. Well, why not? Why not? I mean, imagine a case. I mean, are you satisfied, are you convinced that the scientific knowledge as to the increased incidence of failures of transplants, a striking difference, really striking, and the list of people waiting in New York City to get transplanted, some large number of whom are going to die before there are organs available to them, is relevant to the judge's decision that the standard in New York ought to be brain death rather than that the standard in New York ought to be the older traditional cardiovascular definition. Why does it matter how badly? I need my liver, thank you. How badly is it even relevant as to whether you all need it and what kinds of issues would go into the calculus? Consider Grandpa. Grandpa is in a nursing home with Alzheimer's. Very distressing. Part of the medical reality that we all live in. Very distressing. Grandpa has been there for 7 years. Grandpa has not recognized a soul in 5 years. He has not spoken a word in any language in 5 years. People in the nursing home, staff in the nursing home, clean him up, change his diapers, put him in a wheelchair, put him in front of a television, feed him lunch. They feed him lunch because he won't eat. I mean, he can't eat. He doesn't know to take a spoon and eat. They clean him up. At the end of the day, they put him in and change his diapers, whatever they do, give him vitamins, whatever they do. Grandpa has not spoken a word to a person in 5 years. He breathes, he moves, he takes in food when you put the spoon in his mouth, he excretes. He's alive. As a very caring physician once said to me in such a case, you know, it hurts to say this, but you go to talk to him in the nursing home and there's nobody there. If his grandchildren were in an automobile accident and needed kidneys, and he's close kin, this is an absurd example because of the Alzheimer's, I know that, but if his close kin, his grandchildren, needed kidneys to stay alive, and that would be a terrific match. First question to vote on, would you allow the removal of one of his kidneys? At his age, there's a risk of the operation killing him, but you can live with one kidney. Yes or no, you would vote straw poll, and no one is bound to this. Yes or no, you would vote to authorize removal of one of his kidneys for his granddaughter? Raise your hand. And how many want to vote no? 6 no's and the rest, which is the largest group, yeas. Both kidneys? He'll die. Both kidneys? Well, he's dead already, but we've been feeding him for years. He's been dead. You hear the issues? You hear the issues? What? I'm sorry? Yeah, but if you argue, I don't think he can live. I mean, you can put him on dialysis without 2 kidneys. Would you let them take a liver, that he will die? Would you let them take a heart, that he will... Is any of this relevant to the discussion of what is really dead? He's dead, but hard to are you comfortable with a utilitarian calculus that says his grandchildren will do better for society if we give them the kidneys? That sounds, I mean, you can call me all kinds of names, Nazi and live and die and all this. Medical issues we'll say for another time. The issue here being the notion of subjectivity, which is indeed part of the problem. Art and trash, how will we know the distinction? Well, we could get a chemist. Keep the chemist within the bounds of his decision, of his competency, and I don't think he has much of anything to say as to which is art and to which is trash. Certainly not by our modern view, which you may or may not think I'm fairly characterizing. Plato in the Republic makes a reference, this may help you all with our children, Plato in the Republic makes a reference to the argument that taste is purely private. And in the Republic, Plato says, once a society says that taste in music and taste in hair length, square brackets, it's really there, I kid you not, hair length, end of square brackets, once you say that those are matters of purely private judgment, that's the end of your society, it's all gone. He was defending a notion that there exist standards. Plato is in the higher law or natural law tradition that we spoke about on the earliest occasion. There are in this world, in the United States, there are people who agree with that in many areas. There may well be in this seminar group. There are other views, which quick phrases like beauty is in the eye of the beholders, different strokes for different folks. I want to wear my hair as long. What's it to you? You've got bugs. Oh, that's a health and safety issue. If the school detects head lice, they send the kid home. That's because he's got a contagious bug, head lice. It's ugly. It makes me puke. Go see Gregorian's painting. That made Andy Warhol very happy. It made somebody else puke. Art is in the image of the beholder, and everybody's opinions are equal. Query, and how far to go with this radical denial of standards, and how to pretend that the experts will tell us. I'm pushing hard on this notion with respect to the end of life. What is death? The obvious next part of the discussion would be abortion at the beginning of life. When the biologist can tell you whether sperm are alive or not, given certain shared definitions of alive. You look at the slide under the microscope, and if they're wiggling their tails or whatever it is that they do, then they're alive, and if not, then they're dead. The biologist may be able to tell you whether conception has occurred. The biologist can tell you a lot of things about, with sonar and stuff, can tell you a lot of things about whether the fetus is alive or is not. They can tell you a lot of things, I suggest, as my honest position, that what they cannot tell you at all, zero, is whether it is a human being. That it is alive may be ambiguous, and then one has to study and find out. That's a fact kind of a claim, which precise definitions would have to be given for. That it is a human being, I suggest, is quite beyond the competence in expertise of all the chemists in the world. It's not a chemical issue of their professionalism. It is, now what do you want to say? It is the teaching of a particular tradition as to when human beingness attaches. You want to say it is a function, and in the Catholic Church you might want to say that, and in certain other settings you might want to say that. To say that it is or is not a human, you might want to do in terms of what are the social consequences of treating it as a human. You could overtly be a utilitarian, balancing off utilities. If we treat this as equal in this case, how to go on in another kind of a situation, it is offensive to me that they are killing fetuses at 5 months. Very interesting. It is offensive to her that they are not killing fetuses at 5 months. It is offensive to you. It is offensive to me. It is offensive to... It's offensive to any and all of us, and it is highly subjective, as all these value things are, which is why we like the doctors to come in white coats, but don't give away to the store. Don't give away the store to the doctors in the white coats. This is not science bashing at all. What I am saying is, within the limits of their professional competency, you may get a second opinion from the chief of neurology at another hospital or whatever. I mean, we do procedural protections all the time with organ transplantation. The doc who signs the death certificate in many places is not permitted to be part of the team that wants to do the transplant. So it's to give us a little more procedural confidence that there's no pushing on the edges or chiseling or cheating. That conflict of interest, a good lawyer's word, the conflict of interest is being avoided. Who is to tell us when the body is really dead? Really dead. And incidentally, in a state which has a definition of death accepted, which some number have, how do you deal with variability in belief patterns? What do you do with one patient that comes in and the parents or the family says, we know that under the definition of brain dead in this state, our patient who is comatose can be tested and disconnected from machines in a certain way. We're telling you up front that those are not our beliefs. What you do with everybody else is your business. For our kin, as long as the machine keeps the heart going, you keep the kin on the machine. Should there be a right at $1,000 a day to opt out of society's definition of the standard of death? Or should there not be? Or should it, when I said $1,000 a day, which is, if anything, an understatement for an intensive care unit, is that even relevant to the discussion? Our values tell us that Grandma went to a religious setting, or prayed, however she prayed, in a way that didn't accept brain death as the definition of death, but the state of New York has. There are segments, not all of by any means, there are segments of the Orthodox Jewish community who do not accept brain death even now as a definition of death. Some large number of them live in New York. They say essentially, give us an exemption. Respect our values. Our values are that this person is alive. And for other people, do what you want to do with other people, but for us, exempt. So far, that has not been done on a public basis, but is being worked out quietly on an informal basis. Is that something that someone should be entitled to? When do you have a right to? When do you, dear society, have a right to override my claims of my values? So many of the issues. I mean, you notice how the same issue, the issue of definition, runs across a variety of the specific fact patterns that we've been talking about. All right, censoring the offensive in terms of music and art and trash and stuff like that, there are some easy distinctions. There are questions about children and adults. One has to deal with the issues of children and adults. There are issues of private and public space. What I do in my recreation room with the windows closed and the blinds down, we say is my private business. I will give you the hardest case that I saw against that claim. Not skin flicks and not girly movies and stuff like that. A student told me this to be true. I don't know it otherwise to be true. A student told me that in a catalog of X-rated videos, he came across an advertisement to sell tapes of actual footage taken by the Nazis in Auschwitz and in various of the concentration camps. So, if you are so disposed, you can buy and own this film taken by the Nazis of them abusing Jews, gays, gypsies to various kinds of torments. And you can throw a party in your house, and you can close the shades, and you can only invite people that get their kicks out of this kind of stuff, and you can, you know the rest of the story. And it's none of your business what your neighbor is doing with his shades drawn, watching these films taken by the Nazis in the camps. Unclear to me who would have standing to challenge something like that. That is, for me personally, that one pushes me hard. I don't know that it's been litigated, but it pushes me hard. One of the issues that goes with this is the notion of harassment, targeted harassment. It has to be true on any view of free speech that one can be offensive. The Catholic religious grandma does not want to know about Galileo, or maybe she does want to know from a certain view, or maybe 100 years ago she didn't want to know, and today the church's view is rather different about Galileo. Leave me alone. Thus, don't bother me with your science. It's exceedingly offensive. The grandpa sitting on a rocking chair on the street sees a gay couple go by. That's offensive. Sees an interracial couple go by, a black and a white, or a white and an Asian. That's really offensive. Sees a young woman go by not wearing a skirt and white gloves. At Brown University in the early 1960s, women at Pembroke could only go into the library wearing skirts, no pants, no shorts. That's when we had standards. So giggle, 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 but somebody wants to invite on your campus or on your block to this motion picture business about the Nazis killing off Jews. Giggle some more. It's really gross, right? The Nazi films. They're really offensive. They really shouldn't be allowed. And neither should interracial couples. That's very offensive. Can't live in a society without standards. Can't live in a society without some kinds of standards. Some we have every reason to be suspect about because the censors always have tried to censor things that we like the book Ulysses. It's obscene. It's great literature. Precisely in part because it's obscene. You may know that the immigration officials for years did not let Ulysses be brought, the book, be brought into this country because it was obscene. My own thinking concludes with the notion that for sure we can't let the so-called victim define what we do. There has to be protection of freedoms that are in fact offensive to large numbers of people. Is it possible to carve out a segment which we would call individualized harassment, which is deserving of protection specifically as such? The easiest case to win on is the obscene phone call. Somebody phones me and uses sexual expletives or talks about my religion or about my wife's parentage or whatever. I have a right to hang up, and if that guy persists in calling me, I should be able to have him removed. That's relatively easy. You can't say any unwanted phone call, because these machines that call me to tell me that my order is in at Sears, or people who call to sell me whatever some of you earn a living selling, they're unwanted in the sense that I didn't solicit them. So we allow people. It's content specific. I mean, it's when they call and say, hey, I'd like to tell you about the charity drive for Mothers Against Drunk Driving, would you say, no, thank you very much, or I say, send you $2 or whatever I say. That's very different than when they call and they say, you Jews are going to be run out of this town. It's content specific that makes it offensive. And that's why I want to be protected from being harassed. The case which jogged me on this one, which is unfortunately a true story, was that in Providence, Rhode Island, somebody went through obituaries picking out notices of deaths of people with Jewish names and would send to them, to the mourners whose address is in the newspaper, conventional greeting cards, Hallmark or whatever it was, sympathy on your loss, and then you opened it up, and inside there was a sticker with a big swastika saying, you'll be glad to know we're back. That's pretty crummy. It's crummy in part because the audience is very vulnerable. They're in mourning. Maybe we have to have some notion of private places in addition to in my basement recreation room with the window drawn, with the window shades drawn. Maybe we have to have some kind of notions of private places and how to define them, places when one could reasonably anticipate to be left alone. How to define those. Can't mean the main street in Skokie, Illinois. As much as I don't like Nazis, if there are lots of parades there, then the Nazis have a right to make a parade also, even though it's very hurtful to persons who had lost their relatives in the concentration camps. Specific targeted harassment, maybe Mickeljohn's public-private helps to some extent. When you're running for Congress, it's game to ask questions about stuff that if someone stopped me on the street, it would not be appropriate, or called me as a teacher, or called me as a shoe store operator, and before she buys shoes in my store, she wants to know my view. There are, when you run for Congress, you're in the, certain things that recently came to light in televised hearings of Mr. Justice Thomas for confirmation of the Supreme Court. You could say, if you want to, that he was entitled to privacy on his sex views or his views towards women in general, and or on abortion, and he knew that when he went up for confirmation, and that was fair game. Well, you might criticize the way confirmation hearings run. There'd be a plausible argument. On the argument that says, I don't want to see people walking around with swastikas on their shirts because it bugs it, because it's very offensive to me, there is the notion of the, as mentioned, of the captive audience. It's an easier question to make him cover up the swastika when he's in my classroom because the other students have no choice, or when he's in a bus because the other patrons on the bus have no other choice. I mean, we used to have these idiot boxes blasting us off buses. Now they can come with headsets, and the idiot student can listen to his idiot music without blasting me off. Sure, that's a kind of procedural device, and I think it's quite worthy of respect. But we're going to make them wear earphones whether they're listening to Mozart or to whatever it is that I don't quite know the name of that would be au courant right now about stuff in heavy metal that kids listen to. Targeted speech, hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? Vietnam? That's got to be protected somehow. Is it protected if he goes to his sister's, hypothetical, if he goes to his sister's funeral? Civility, you leave people alone when they're burying their kin? Well, depends how many Vietnamese you think he's killed off that week and what your views are. You might not be in the mood to be very civil. I don't know what I would say about that. I mean, easy enough to distinguish out cemeteries and then a few other kinds of places. He goes to the movies with Mrs. Johnson or anybody such. Hey, hey, LBJ, they came to see Walt Disney. They don't want politics. When can you thrust your political and social concerns upon an uninterested or an unconcerned audience? Voltaire has to be playable at my university, and is, to my knowledge. Voltaire is virulently anti-religious and anti-Catholic. He's Voltaire. He's been dead a long time. Targeted harassment. Hard to know, hard to know. I would like to see some sort of protection of a very small universe of such cases, but I recognize that it's hard to draw the lines. We've had a number of sessions together now. We have had a number of off-the-camera conversations now. It occurs to me that we have not resolved many of the issues. Well, the obvious answer is that in the next 4 sessions we will have to worry about the obvious answers, and I certainly appreciate your availability for those sessions and see where we go.